Hello everyone and welcome to our final lecture for Unit 7.2 where we're going to be looking at what I call the art of exploration. But in all honesty, I really feel like it would be better to call this the art of encounter because exploration and discovery of the Americas took place kind of right before the High Renaissance. So this is more an exploration of what is going to happen when the art of the European world really starts to meet in with what was going on in the new world of Latin America. So we're kind of talking about Mexico and also South America is where we're going to be primarily focusing. So just to set up a little bit of context, we know that Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492 and that he came there from Spain. He was sent over by the Spanish king and queen, Isabella and Ferdinand. So you got to understand that 1492 is when he discovers the Americas. And then you obviously have a large progression of time where we're going to settle, the Spanish and Portuguese are going to settle Mexico and South America. And while all of that is happening, there's been a lot of art happening in Europe. So you can imagine that right about the time they're discovering the Americas, we're in the High Italian Renaissance. Then there's going to be Mannerists. And by the time things start to get settled and people from Spain are really starting to come over here and settle, including artists, those art movements are going to come over with them. So one of the first major art movements that's really going to impact the Americas that's going to be brought over from Europe is going to be the Baroque, because the High Renaissance had really kind of passed by the time they came over here and settled. And we're going to be able to see that in Latin American art, which really does have its own kind of Latin American Baroque. So what we're going to start to see happen is also the impact of the Protestant Reformation, because Spain is obviously a very Catholic country. So 1517, you see the start of the Protestant Reformation. Then we're going to have the Counter-Reformation really kick off in the late 1500s and the 1600s, which of course is what really brings out the Baroque. So what we're going to need to see happen is that as the Catholic Church and the countries that support them, including Spain, are trying to regain as much as possible their fellowship, they're also going to be looking for new converts. So the Baroque is also going to come over to the Americas because it is about conversion and creating an emotional experience that people want to join. So all of those factors together are going to really bring the Baroque over to the New World. All right, so we've kind of already talked about this a little bit, but one thing that we really haven't talked about is that people over here in the Americas, the Amerindians, already had, and I don't even like calling them the Indians because that was obviously a misnomer, but they already had their own artistic styles. We've seen this in first semester if you took it, and if you didn't, just do understand that the cultures of the Aztecs in Mexico and the Incas and the cultures before them, like the Chavin and the Olmec, they had artistic traditions, and the Maya. And so we're going to see some of those things continue on, even though there's a large push to kind of eradicate the spiritual center of these Latin American countries, because to these Latin American areas like the Aztecs and the Incas, their religion was their politics. It's what drove everything they did. Their cities were essentially ceremonial and political centers tied together. Religion and state were very, very joined. So what we start to see happen is as the Spanish conquistadors come over, they will try to eradicate and get rid of some of that art that's over here, especially their spiritual centers, because it's kind of like to take the soul out of them a little bit and then replace it with Christianity. So for example, the Aztecs, we see the Temple Mayor is destroyed. In the Inca capital, we see Coricancha, which is their temple of the sun to their god Inti, which is going to be destroyed. But we are still going to see techniques that are Native American, and we're also going to see their culture try to hold on a little bit. And also we're going to see that start to blend in with what is coming over from Europe. And even more interesting is when the first artists came over, they were Spanish, but eventually we're going to start to see Latin American artists who are Mexican born or South American born, who also develop and adapt those techniques and kind of mix them in with native styles. So it's not going to be too long before we start to see artists who are Latin American instead of just being from Spain who rise in popularity. So one work of art that they've included in the 250 to kind of show one of the purposes of art that developed in Latin America is the Codex Mendoza, and it's named after the Mendoza viceroy who actually asked for it to be made. Now, I should probably explain what a viceroy is. So, unlike North America and the British colonies, where those colonies were founded by people who wanted to come over to the New World and take that risk and would do it with the backing of the crown, maybe not financially, but they would join together with other investors and come over here and establish these colonies and basically take the risks on their own. They put up their money to do it. But in Spain, in particular, their colonization of the Americas was led by the king and queen. They were the ones financing it. They were the ones that stipulated how things was going to go. And in Britain, if you came over here as somebody who was trying to get away from Britain, if you bought land, that was your land. That's not how it worked in Latin America. It was the Spanish crown's land. You were just being entrusted with it. So Mendoza was what we called a viceroy. So if you think like vice president, they're just below the president, but they ultimately do what the president says. And Roy comes from ROI, which means king. So the viceroys were basically vice kings, and they were given viceroyalities. Like they were basically given little pieces of land or big pieces of land, depending on who you were, that were yours to do what you will with. But the job that you had was to make sure you did it for the crown. And it wasn't land that was given to you in perpetuity. You don't get to keep it. You don't get to pass it down through generations. It's given to you by the king. He's entrusting his land to you, essentially. So Mendoza is one of these viceroys. And what he wanted to do was kind of create a document of the culture that was here, of the Aztecs. So this is going to be in Mexico, all right? And it really is the most valuable resource we have of the Aztecs. It's something that historians really rely on a lot about the Aztec history and to prove who they were and what they did, because a large number of them were wiped out due to disease or warfare or overuse as basically slaves. So Mendoza asked native Aztecs to create this codex, which is a book, all right, with different pages in it, to kind of document essentially the Aztec culture. So right here we have what's called the frontispiece, all right? So this is the front page essentially of this codex that you're looking at right here. And it was created by Aztecs, but then there were Spanish people who could speak this native language who actually kind of decoded it for people. So for example, right here, if you can see the little figures on here, you can see that they have writing on them. And it's kind of like their names and their statuses and who they actually are. And they make them look a little bit different based on their status. So for example, one of these we believe is a priest because his face is a little bit different. It's a different shade. We're looking at buildings that we think may have been the Temple Mayor. If you look at this from an aerial view and you kind of pan back a little bit, you'll see that this is actually showing the city of Tenochtitlan, which was kind of like Venice. It was based on a lake with water channels that ran through it. So you have the 4 different directions of Tenochtitlan. And then right in the middle of it, sitting in the center of what would be the lake, you have an eagle sitting on a cactus with a snake in its mouth, which of course is what's on the symbol of Mexico, paying tribute to its Aztec heritage, because this was what the Aztecs were told they would find when they found the place they were supposed to settle their city, was they would find a eagle sitting on a cactus with a snake in its mouth, and they found it in the middle of Lake Texaco. And that's where they decided to settle and build this beautiful city of Tenochtitlan. And what we have here on this front page, all right, is how it was made up. We see plants, we see the skulls for possible human sacrifice, we see the Aztec symbol on the top of it, we see different figures and different roles, like the priest with the darker face. We see them down here at the bottom, potentially either fighting, or it could also be that they are, training for warfare, because the Aztecs were very warfaring people. And then around the perimeter of this, you see different glyphs. And each one of these glyphs is a different symbol of a year. And essentially what they have done is made it more linear, because the European calendar was much more linear, but because it goes all the way around the page, Aztec time is cyclical. They believe that this word apocalypse basically means like a new beginning, and that there will be fire and destruction and then rising from the ashes. So this kind of signals like that 52-year cycle of how they perceive time. So these are some other pages within this, and you can see that here on the left, this is actually from the Codex, and it is tributes that other states were expected to provide to the Aztecs, because when they took you over, they would probably take some of your people for prisoners of war so they could sacrifice them, because that's what their god's favorite taste was, for human sacrifice. But you would also pay tributes to the Aztecs. And the reason you would do this is because the Aztecs would then give it to their soldiers, who would then feel rewarded, and they would keep conquering and keep stopping rebellions and keep expanding because they needed more slaves for rebellion. Over here on the right, you're looking at possible farming techniques and animals. There's lots of different interpretations for what these are. Just a couple other pages, we see more tributes. Feathers were a very big deal, especially the more rare that they were. The Aztecs, we talked about last semester, the Aztec feather headdress, which was made of these bright green feathers that you could only get 2 per bird. So think about how many feathers or birds you'd have to kill to get it. And then over here on the left, you see actually the Temple Mayor. It's one of the best resources we have of what their major temple of where their sacrifices took place would have looked like. And the writing that is on it, you can see, is done by a Spanish priest who could speak the native language. There's some other pages here for you guys to see. All right. So we've kind of already talked about this a little bit. So I'm going to move on from here, but just understand that, this one of these first artworks that we have that comes out of Latin America was simply to document what was going on here for posterity so that people could remember it whenever it was essentially gone. And what's crazy about it is this never originally made it to Spain. It was captured by French pirates who paid I think the equivalent of $20 or $30 for it. Whenever they sold it later for just a very small amount, not realizing how incredibly important it was. All right. Now, originally, I talked to you at the very beginning of this lecture about the fact that as the Protestant Reformation kind of rocks Europe, you have this effort by Spanish countries to find more converts for the Catholic Church, because the kings of Spain did get their right to rule from the Pope. They were very, very devout. So this new land in the Americas with these savages, as they consider them, was a perfect place to bring over Christianity and gain new converts one way or another, which we will talk about this piece that's right here. But you need to look at it for a second and probably realize that this is very Baroque. It has got that dramatic colors, like the colors of state, like red and gold and black. It has that dramatic lighting that is to it. It's very, elaborate and very naturalistic. And you can see that Baroque artistic technique has made its way over to Latin American countries, because these, which were primarily in South America and especially in Spanish South America, are going to be very, very popular. All right. So I like to tell my world history students that there were really 3 main motivators of exploration for Spain to go and explore the New World. And of course, they didn't know they were going to find it. They ran into it. But that's the 3 G's: God, glory, and gold. All right. So gold is obviously the big one. Glory is for the glory of the king and queen. But then, of course, there was God, that they were doing it for their faith, especially after the Protestant Reformation, to get more people back. So what we have here is basically a spiritual Baroque Bible that is visual, right, for these people to see, because they obviously can't speak, Spanish. They can't read the Bible at this point without it being translated to them. So what we have here is what's called the angel with arquebus, Aziel Timor Day, right? So this is essentially an angel carrying a gun, right? The arquebus is a gun. It's one of the first ones that would be hoisted onto the shoulder to actually be shot. And this is identified as the angel, Aziel, and it's an angel of God, all right? So the kind of message that you have here, the entire purpose of this is that you will convert. Soldiers were considered, or angels were considered at this point, to be the soldiers of the church. That was their job. They were the troops with their boots on the ground. They were the ones who could get to people quicker. They could spread their message by, the word or the sword, whatever it is. And what's kind of crazy is that over in Europe, they'd actually stopped producing angels. But because they did have kind of that Roman look to them, kind of like, cherubs and stuff like that. But that message didn't get all the way over to the Americas. They didn't quite get that memo of stop with the angels already. So in South America, we get these angels carrying guns. All right. So it's this idea of they are the ones spreading the message of God one way or another. And it's either going to be through a peaceful message or it's going to be through the gun. And since angels over in Europe weren't really being shown at the time, this is kind of an American version of the warfaring angel. All right. So this was created by the master of Calamarca. So Calamarca, I left an A out of there, in Bolivia. And so now we're actually starting to see masters of art who are from the Americas, whether that means they're born here or they came over here or they were, Amerindians who learned this style of painting. But this particular, these angels with an arquebus actually shows a great deal of mixing of what is European, which is the Baroque painting style. So if you guys go back and look at this, that is Baroque painting. It looks like it could have come from Italy. It's oil paint, naturalistic detail, good amount of lighting and shade. It's a moment in time. It's very, very Baroque, all right? However, we're also starting to see two other cultures mixed in with this. We're seeing Amerindian, right? So people native to here, and the Spanish adopting that. And we're also seeing Creoles, which is people who have been born in the Americas, but are both of Europe. Their parents were both white, and they have kind of created their own culture over here. So let's break this down. The painting style itself, definitely European, right? That came from here, or from Europe. But if you notice that a lot of these angels have feathers on them, and the feathers was something that they adopted from Amerindians. It's this idea of birds being able to fly and reach closer to God and to the sun. And since angels could fly, feathers just made a lot of sense. All right, so that worked for them. So they adopted the feathers. Now, if you look at the fact that these angels are wearing clothes that look European, they're actually not. All right, the hat is European. So that's a European style hat. However, if you look at the clothing that they're wearing, it's very big and it's very, very baggy, and it's very, very loose. And that is something that developed in Creole America. Whenever the people who had settled here from Spain, it was hot here. It's near the equator. So what they would do is keep these baggy clothes that were much lighter and airier than something that was heavy and clinging to them. So it's almost a little bit more flowy and loose to kind of help them with the heat at this time. All right. Now, because they didn't want this to look too threatening, one of the things that they do with the angels holding the guns, all right, is that they usually try to pair it with that they're holding the gun in a non-threatening way. The hint is still there that they have one. But so, for example, this angel, he's not pointing it at everything. This guy over here, he's looking away. This guy back here, he's not pointing it at you. And if he had tried to fire it the way he's holding it, he would have knocked his teeth out. So they're also usually with a very serene expression on their face. They look calm. They don't look menacing. All right. So it's kind of this idea that, yes, there's a gun, and yes, these angels are powerful and they are soldiers, but at the same time, they're not that threatening, although they could be. Hey. Okay, so the next work of art that we're going to look at also shows a blending together of cultures, but definitely not in the same way. All right, so if you've done your homework, then you're pretty aware of what these are actually showing. And these were not created to be decorative paintings. They weren't meant to be hung up in somebody's home as something that's pretty. These were actually works of scientific inquiry, and they're incredibly wrong. Actually, factually, they're not really right at all. But what these show is not just the mixing of art styles, but also the literal mixing of cultures and what was happening with this combination of cultures that was happening in Latin American countries. So, for example, you have Spanish, pure blood, white Spanish, coming over from, well, in terms of white, that's what they were considered, white. You're coming over from Spain. And because a lot of the people that came over here for Latin America were men instead of whole families like in North America, they would often, because they were going to be here for a long time, mix in with the native populations. And mixing in with the Native Americans was not considered that bad. Right, that was actually considered a necessity, and they actually showed it to where, like, after 3 generations, basically, that the offspring would then just basically be Spanish, because it would be almost entirely Spanish blood, which of course is not accurate. So you have here basically what's happening is a visual depiction of what would happen when different ethnicities were mixing in the Americas. So that includes not only Native Americans and the Spanish and the Creoles, who had 2 white parents or Spanish parents, but were born here in the Americas. Then you also throw in the fact that there were Africans being brought over for slave purposes, and that's going to be another part of this. All right. So you can see here, for example, you have a Native American woman, and then you see an African male, and then this would be the depiction of what would happen with the offspring. That this is how the skin color of the offspring that they produced. So again, when the Spanish and the Portuguese came over here, they needed a way to kind of distinguish who was at the top of the social order, and skin color is a very visible way to do that. So to these people, essentially skin color was important, but it also mattered what your lineage was. And there were a great deal of Native American women who would try to get papers put together that said that their children had Spanish blood, because that way their status would improve, because they were part Spanish. So over here in the Americas, you had the viceroys who were sent over by the king and were given this entrusted piece of land to make sure that they got everything out of it for the king, and then they got a benefit for themselves. Then there are peninsulares who came over here and settled to work on smaller pieces of land, to do administrative things, to establish farms, and they were born on the Spanish peninsula. Then there are Creoles who have 2 Spanish parents, but again are born in the Americas, which for some reason still gave them lower status because they just weren't born on the European continent. Then you get mestizo, which is a white parent and a Native American parent. Then there was mulatto, which is a white parent and an African native parent. And then after that, there was native born. At the lowest level of this was natives who were with natives and slaves who were with slaves, or natives who were with slaves. And the lower you got on the status, the more it was portrayed as kind of less civilized. Children would be shown misbehaving. The facial expressions would be shown as a little bit miserable. And it was this idea that, you know, life wasn't as good, or it wasn't as pure. The darker the blood, the darker the soul, essentially. Right. So it was just not a really accurate way of showing anything. All right. So what they have picked for the 250 is one of these that we call casta paintings. All right, so casta is cast paintings. And these were usually done in sets of 16. It was never just one, there was a set, because it wanted to show, all right, what would happen as different groups or races or ethnicities blended together. All right, so what you would want to show is, you know, the Spanish also wanted to use these a little bit as propaganda to show how they had civilized this place, that they had made it better here, essentially. So they would show Native American women who had married a Spanish man in much more European style dress, and they would be very happy and content. And this one right here really, really bothers me. This is the one that they picked for it. All right, and it kind of really, to me, is an issue. And the text at the bottom underneath this one was, in America, people are born in diverse colors, customs, temperaments, and languages. From the Spaniard and Indian is born the mestizo. And your skin color also had temperaments associated with it. I mean, it was basically your entire personality was based on your skin color and your identifying characteristics. So, for example, a mestizo is usually humble, quiet, and simple. So kind of saying that this is a good match. Like if it is a white person mixed with a Native American, that is totally fine. And then underneath their child, who the father is kind of blessing with this paternal love, is an African that is carrying the native on its back. So kind of reinforcing that even the native, or excuse me, the African, excuse me, is below the native born child mixed of a native and a Spanish. So the title is Spanish and Indian Produce a Mestizo, all right, by Rodrigo Juarez. And it's just, to me, it's absolutely terrible. But the way they were also trying to show it, because these were very popular in Europe. These actually weren't really for people in the Americas. They were more for the people in Europe to know what was happening over here, is by showing that she's got nice jewelry on. Look, he's elevated her status. They can afford servants, kind of putting the Africans in their place. She has nice European style dress and earrings, and she's very happy, you know, and he is, you know, loving and blessing this child. All right. So you also would see, as these progress down, right, you would see the facial expression start to change. Like, it wasn't so loving and it wasn't so happy. Children would be shown misbehaving or doing what they weren't supposed to do. They actually had a belief that two Africans mixed together would produce an albino. I mean, that was their, you know, they thought that one would negate the other. So this one right here that I'm showing you is an example of a Costa painting, and this is honestly probably a Creole, because a Creole was lower than a Spaniard. So you notice that she's not actually dressed as elaborately. She has on a European style dress, but the child or the daughter is wearing like a Native American style blouse. Like, the clothing was definitely part of this, all right? So this one right here, so Rodriguez probably did this, all right, is actually one of the earlier Costa paintings, because it shows like this very peaceful and happy scene, right? And then over time, as the lines started to blur together with all of this racial mixing, you wanted to still make sure that the people of Spanish blood were towards the top. So therefore, later on, as they wanted to make sure that people who were Native and African were towards the bottom, they didn't look very happy. It was far less peaceful. Yeah. So for example, these are some later scenes to kind of show, like, this is how they would show, you know, you don't want this, all right? This is, you know, they would say that this is not good, that this is bad temperament. This is how people act. It just wasn't favorable. All right. So when you would see these sets together, you're typically going to see a man and a woman that would identify a Costa painting, and then a child that would basically show the recipe of the mixing. So if you take a Spanish and you take a Native American, then you get a mestizo, all right? They liked to show the people in Europe that things were great over here. And so you would see the men very well dressed and experiencing scenes of leisure, right? So that they're reading, they're riding horses, they're doing things because life is so great over here. And any nature in the background would be flourishing and thriving, because this new world was full of opportunities and everything's great here. So please keep investing your money in the Americas. And they would show Africans and mulattoes as, you know, different jobs like coachmen or domestic servants, to be like, look, everything's in order here. Everybody has their place. All right. This is the jobs that these people have. Native Indians were usually shown as food vendors to kind of be like, you know, we have this wonderful native food here. If you were mestizo, you would be shown doing the jobs you were allowed to do. So not only was it showing what happened with skin color, it showed the order of things over here in terms of what jobs people could have, all right? And the scenes were meant to be things that were showing prosperity, that plants and animals, and totally not showing that over here, the Spanish, a lot of the men were drunks and just, you know, abusing a lot of people. And, you know, not all of them, obviously, but it was happening over here. They were taking advantage of their position and their distance away from Spain. Basically, the idea is to send back home to Spain. Everything's great here. Everybody has their place. They're happy about it. We're doing great over here. Everything's wonderful. So let's just keep doing it. All right, so here's some other examples of those Costa paintings. All right. Now, another way that these viceroys, aside from showing their status in these Costa paintings, to show their status was these viceroys had some very, very nice homes, like incredibly nice homes. And what they would like to do is bring decoration into their homes because the viceroys would be entertaining visitors from all over the place. They'd be entertaining people from Europe, they'd be entertaining people from Native America, and even Japan. People were coming over here during this time. And the viceroys would live on estates called haciendas, all right? That was their estate on this viceroyalty, this piece of land that they had. And the art that they had in their homes, because a lot of the people may not speak that language, could be used to show off their wealth, but also at the same time, educate the people who came into the home. So kind of to tell stories about the wonderful, awesome place of Spain, all right? So one of the things that was very popular in the viceroyalities, in these haciendas, in their homes, were these folding screens, all right? And these folding screens were actually Japanese, because during this time, the Japanese were very interested in trading with the Americas. They wanted to know what was going on over here, and vice versa. The Spanish in the Americas were very interested in what was going on in Japan. And that's obviously going to include art as well. So the Gonzalez family, one of the viceroyalities, really liked artists in the Americas. So they asked for the creation of one of these folding biombo screens. So it's called a biombo. They wanted one of these screens for their homes because on one side of the screen, the men would talk with men, and on the other side is where the women would sit, if there were any women, while the men were talking business. So this particular screen, all right, so this biombo screen is the screen with the siege of Belgrade, and there is so much meaning to this, all right? So basically what had happened is the Ottoman Turks were really starting to pave a way from Turkey into Europe. Like they were really barreling through, getting as close as Austria. And the Spanish Habsburg family, so that was the ruling family of Spain at the time, was the Habsburg, launched a huge attack against the Ottoman Turks in Serbia and beat them. So it was a huge event. Not only were they saving territory, but they were basically saving Christendom, which of course they're trying to really enforce here in the Americas, that they will defeat any enemy, including a religious enemy. So this viceroy was appointed by Charles II, who was a Habsburg king. And in honor of that, right, the Gonzalez family asked for this screen, which honored a major event for the Habsburgs, because the Habsburgs had given him this viceroyalty. So this biombo folding screen, which has on it this scene of the Spanish saving Belgrade from the Turks, was put into their home. And the men who would come in case they were coming as ambassadors, would be reminded not only of the religious strength of Spain, but also the military strength of Spain, right? And then on the other side was a much more peaceful scene of a hunt of the upper class, where they're going out hunting deer and animals and things like that. So this is that screen, right? And you can see here, it's not very good with the perspective, right? It's kind of, tilted up. So maybe that hadn't quite made it all the way over. And in fact, this is actually going to be a style gotten from the Dutch, who aren't the best at linear perspective. But it's a very violent scene, very, very chaotic. And here it is showing basically the Spanish Habsburg generals going in and attacking the Serbian, or the Turks who were attacking Serbia. Right, so just to kind of draw in a little bit detail, you can see that it's kind of got that atmospheric perspective in the back. You can see that they're, saving this town from siege. They're, really coming in and saving the day. So it kind of looks a little bit like a European tapestry, except it's not on just a flat hanging carpet. It's actually done on this biombo folding screen. All right. So I like to explain that this biombo folding screen shows a combination of East meets West, right? So you have the folding screen, which is Japanese, all right? And biombo is a Spanish translation of biobu, which is protection from the wind, which is what these screens were, all right? And because they had so much silver in the Americas, they were able to purchase things like this from Japan, or they could trade, because the Japanese really wanted to trade with Europe because Europe had gunpowder weapons, all right? So what these people would do in Spain is they would either send goods from Japan, or, they would get goods from Asian markets, and they started to kind of like the Japanese style. Now, there is one thing on here that is actually Native American, and that's called encanchado, all right? Which they were inspired by the Japanese ability to get this reflection of light, like this gold color could get this beautiful reflection of light. So in Mexico, what they would do is they would take shells and they would smash them up. And then they would take the shell that was the iridescent side, so the kind of that side that, the inside of the shell that reflected the light, and they would glue them and lacquer them. So you would have an oil painted screen or painting, and then you would take these shells and put them on them and then lacquer over it so that they stayed. So it almost creates like this beautiful reflective light, kind of like the gold in the Japanese screens. So you have a European scene on a Japanese screen with Mexican shells. Okay. So this is what we're talking about with that encanchado technique, which is very, very difficult to see. All right. But you take oil painting, all right. Then you take the shells, which are already sparkly and iridescent. You add over some gold, you lacquer over it and seal, and it makes it look like very wealthy and elaborate and kind of just added to that, Japanese screen that they had. All right. So at the time, one of the things that inspired this was the Dutch were getting really into news printmaking. So like using their newspapers, essentially some of the first newspaper to tell major events. So this was kind of an inspiration from that. All right. People in Denmark were investors in the exploration that they were doing. So the Dutch were making sure they were using newspapers to show their investors what was happening in their colonies like this. So the screen actually shows a very similar style to this telling of events, almost like photojournalism in a way of capturing the entire scene in one image so that people could get the idea in just one viewing of the screen. So speaking of that encanchado technique, if you look right here, you'll see those tiny pieces of shell on Mary's robe and even on where her hands are and things like that. So we have a painted scene, an oil painted scene, and then over that you have these little pieces of shell that have been dusted in gold and then covered up to kind of like with lacquer, so like a clear lacquer to kind of create this heavenly light and image. And they would want that for this scene because unlike the Siege of Belgrade, which is a non-religious scene, this is a very religious one. All right, so this is the Virgin of Guadalupe, right? And the Virgin of Guadalupe is a very popular scene in Mexican iconography. And in fact, it's considered to be the patron saint of Mexico. And I've seen pictures of this all over St. Louis too. This is again another example of East meeting West. All right, so it's several cultures all together. So basically what had happened, the legend was that a man named Juan Diego had been standing on a hill and had had this vision of a flower goddess that was a very important flower goddess to the Aztecs named Tanatzin, and that image had imprinted itself on his coat, and he had gone to go and show a priest. He's like, look, I saw Tanatzin, I saw her. And the priest, seeing an opportunity, says, no, it's a flower goddess, but it's not that. It's you saw Mary. Mary has appeared to you here. She is here in Mexico with you. And so all of a sudden now, in fact, they actually went and tore down an Aztec temple and then built this basilica to the Virgin of Guadalupe. Kind of, the priest was basically saying that this native did not see Tanatzin. He saw instead Mary. And we've seen Mary shown with flowers before, like violets, which are a symbol of modesty. All right, we've seen that in the birth of Venus, where there's flowers everywhere around her. So what we have here is an oil painting of Mary. And notice that they make it very clear she's not Native American. They make sure it's very clear that her hands and face are white, which she also wasn't, but in European depiction, she's white. She is surrounded by a golden aura and a crescent moon, which in the book of Revelations is how Mary is described. So it's basically reinforcing that this is Mary and Mary is here. She is in America. She is accessible to you. You thought you saw your flower goddess, but you're really seeing Mary. And then if you look in the roundels, which are the small little pictures off to the sides being held by these European angels, it's the scenes of Juan Diego having his vision to kind of reinforce that this is Mary and she's here in the Americas to kind of help people in the Americas feel like they could convert, like it's that Mary is accessible to them. And she's placed over, if you look here, she's placed over their crest. She's on an eagle holding a cactus, so kind of giving tribute to their gods, but then at the same time kind of saying, like the Delphic Sibyls in the Sistine Chapel ceiling, that all along this was just a prophecy of Mary and Jesus coming, because here she is. She appeared in Mexico City, right here to you. That's why you were led here. So what we're looking at is essentially spiritual conquest. Like this Virgin of Guadalupe put Mary in the New World. And again, by putting underneath it, like everything they do is it's evident it's Mary. The light radiating out from her, as it says in Revelations, the crescent moon, the white skin, the fact that she's wearing the blue dress, all of that. And then they use that inconchado technique of those shells reflecting this heavenly light. So that's Native American in it, mixed with Christian beliefs and Spanish techniques. She's not from the Americas. She's clearly not Native. She's come here in kind of like this heavenly realm, like basically heaven and Mary have come to the Americas. This is way different from the Rotkin Pieta, because the Rotkin Pieta that we looked at, that's Jesus and Mary on earth as human, but this is in another world appearing to them, and she's an object of worship, basically. So what we see here with the Virgin of Guadalupe is this, basically spiritual conversion by taking something native, synchronizing it with, the Spanish beliefs, making it very clear that this is European Mary and not some Native American goddess, and making it seem as though like all this time they were just waiting for her to appear. And even their God led them here to this cactus with this snake, or this, eagle sitting on it with this snake, because Mary would appear to them here. Like it was all part of the plan all along.